For 1,277 days, a man sat alone in a concrete room with no windows, no human contact, and no idea whether he would ever leave alive. The CIA didn't put a terrorist there. They didn't put a war criminal there. They put a man who had walked across the Iron Curtain and handed them everything he knew, a man who had defected and begged for their protection. His name was Yuri Ivanovich Nosenko. And what the United States government did to him in secret, for 3.5 years, wouldn't be officially acknowledged for decades. What you're about to hear is not a Cold War spy thriller. It's something darker. It's a story about what happens when the most powerful intelligence agency in the world decides it cannot afford to believe someone, and then has to make sure nobody else believes them either. The files were buried, the witnesses were silenced, and the man himself was hidden so completely that for years his own family didn't know if he was alive. This is what really happened to Yuri Nosenko. On February 4, 1964, a Soviet KGB officer named Yuri Nosenko walked into a CIA safe house in Geneva, Switzerland, and made a request that should have been celebrated. He wanted to defect permanently. He was 36 years old. He held the rank of lieutenant colonel in the KGB's Second Chief Directorate, the division responsible for surveilling foreign visitors inside the Soviet Union, and he was handing over intelligence that could have taken years to extract by any other means. The CIA assigned him the cryptonym A.E. Foxtrot, standard procedure. What happened next was not standard. What happened next was the beginning of one of the most controversial, most debated, and most morally catastrophic operations in the agency's entire history. Because Nosenko had arrived exactly 74 days after the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, and he was carrying a claim that would detonate inside Langley like a grenade. He told the CIA that the KGB had a file on Lee Harvey Oswald, and he had read it personally. Oswald had lived in the Soviet Union from 1959 to 1962. He had tried to renounce his American citizenship. He had married a Soviet woman. By every measure that existed, the KGB should have recruited him, cultivated him, turned him into an asset. He was exactly the profile they wanted. Nosenko's message was unambiguous. The KGB had evaluated Oswald and dismissed him. Too erratic, too unreliable. The Soviet Union had nothing to do with the death of John Kennedy. For the Warren Commission, for the American government, for a nation still raw with grief and paranoia, this was potentially the most important intelligence claim since the end of World War II, and one man at the CIA decided immediately, with absolute certainty, that it was a lie. James Jesus Angleton was the CIA's chief of counterintelligence, and he was, by almost every account, a genius operating in the final stages of paranoid collapse. He had spent years convinced that the CIA had been penetrated at the highest levels by a Soviet mole, a sleeper agent burrowing through the agency from the inside, feeding Moscow everything. This theory had already destroyed careers, paralyzed operations, and driven multiple CIA officers to ruin. Angleton's entire worldview was built around the testimony of a single previous KGB defector named Anatoly Golitsyn, who had arrived in 1961 and told Angleton exactly what Angleton wanted to hear, that the CIA was compromised, that Soviet intelligence was running a master deception operation, and that any future KGB defector should be treated as a plant. Golitsyn had even told Angleton directly, if another KGB officer ever defected and contradicted his information, that defector would be a false flag, a Soviet plant, a deception operation. And then Nosenko arrived. Nosenko failed his first CIA polygraph, or more precisely, the results were inconclusive. In the world of counterintelligence, inconclusive was enough. Angleton was convinced. Nosenko wasn't a defector. Nosenko was a Soviet operation. His entire story, the Oswald exoneration, the KGB files, all of it, fabricated. A scripted performance designed to mislead the Warren Commission and protect whoever had actually been behind Kennedy's assassination. The question became, what do you do with a Soviet spy who is pretending to be a defector, who knows that you know, but who you cannot officially charge, cannot officially imprison, and cannot release? In April of 1964, Yuri Nosenko was taken to a specially constructed cell at a CIA facility in the United States. The precise location has never been fully declassified, but documents point to a compound near Camp Peary, Virginia, what CIA officers called the farm. The room was 12 feet by 12 feet, concrete walls, no windows, a steel cot bolted to the floor, a toilet, a single overhead light that never turned off, no books, no radio, no human contact beyond the guards who slid food through a slot in the door and never spoke. A 1994 CIA Inspector General's review would later note with considerable understatement that Nosenko's conditions would not have been approved at any federal penitentiary in the United States. He had not been charged with any crime. He had not been tried. No court had authorized his detention. No judge had reviewed his case. He was held entirely outside the legal system of the country that was holding him. A ghost prisoner of the Central Intelligence Agency. Months passed, then a year, then 2. The light never changed, the silence never broke. His interrogators came periodically, demanding he confess to being a Soviet plant, demanding he name his KGB handlers, demanding he recant his story about Oswald. He refused, every time, through hunger, through isolation, through what any clinical psychologist would recognize as the deliberate engineering of psychological collapse. One CIA officer who reviewed the file decades later made the comparison explicitly. Nosenko's conditions were, in some respects, more psychologically controlled than a Soviet gulag, because at least in a gulag, prisoners interacted with other prisoners. Sensory deprivation at this level, constant light, total silence, zero human contact, produces measurable psychological damage within 72 hours in clinical trials. Nosenko was subjected to it for 3.5 years. By 1966, the CIA's own psychological assessors were quietly noting something that contradicted Angleton's entire theory. Nosenko's story hadn't changed, not in the details that mattered. Under conditions designed specifically to produce inconsistency, contradiction, and confession, he remained consistent. This created a problem the agency had not anticipated. If Nosenko was a plant, he should have cracked. Soviet deception operations required human beings as their vehicles, and human beings break under sufficient pressure. The KGB knew this. They trained their assets to withstand interrogation, but not years of solitary confinement with no external contact, no reinforcement, no way to receive updated instructions. The more Nosenko held firm, the more Angleton's faction doubled down. His consistency wasn't evidence of truthfulness. It was evidence of exceptional training. The more unbreakable he was, the more dangerous he must be. Inside Langley, a faction war was erupting. A group of CIA analysts, led by a case officer who believed Nosenko was genuine, were compiling evidence that Angleton's entire theoretical framework was built on a foundation that could not be independently verified. Golitsyn, the defector whose word had built the entire case against Nosenko, had provided 52 specific intelligence leads to the CIA since his defection. 7 had been confirmed. 45 were unverified or had proven inaccurate. The man whose testimony was being used to imprison Yuri Nosenko had an accuracy rate of 13.5%. In 1968, an internal CIA review of the entire Nosenko case produced what became known as the Scotch Verdict Report, a document that reached a devastating conclusion. It could not prove Nosenko was a plant. It could not prove he was genuine. After 4 years of imprisonment and interrogation, the CIA knew exactly as much as it had known the day he walked into the Geneva safe house. In 1969, 5 years after Nosenko's defection, a new CIA officer named Bruce Soley was assigned to conduct a completely independent review of the case. Soley was from a different division than Angleton. He had no stake in the existing conclusion. He went back to the original documents, the original intelligence, and the original claims. His conclusion was unambiguous. Nosenko's information had been accurate. The KGB files he described existed. The operational details he provided had been corroborated through independent intelligence gathering. He was not a plant. In late 1969, Yuri Nosenko was released from his concrete box. He had been held for 5 years and 2 months without charge, without trial, and without legal representation. The CIA gave him a cash settlement, a new identity, and a job as a consultant, briefing American intelligence officers on KGB tradecraft. The man they had tried to break was now being paid to teach their people. The irony is almost too dark to absorb. For 5 years, the CIA had insisted Nosenko was an enemy. Then they handed him a salary and an office. James Angleton resigned from the CIA in 1974 under pressure after a different scandal. His domestic surveillance program was exposed by the Church Committee. He died in 1987, never publicly conceding that his treatment of Nosenko had been wrong. The Church Committee, the Senate investigation that exposed the CIA's domestic operations, the assassination plots, the illegal experiments, came within arm's reach of the Nosenko case but never fully excavated it. The most damning details remained classified. The real reckoning came in stages. In 1994, after a Freedom of Information Act request by the National Security Archive, a tranche of documents was released that confirmed the full scope of what had been done to Nosenko. The CIA's own Inspector General concluded that the interrogation and imprisonment program had been outside the boundaries of acceptable intelligence practice and had involved techniques inconsistent with American law and values. The specific techniques documented included continuous artificial lighting designed to disrupt sleep cycles and circadian rhythm, complete prohibition of reading material for extended periods reaching 18 months, caloric restriction. Nosenko lost significant body weight during his imprisonment, deliberate temperature manipulation, and total social isolation enforced for the entirety of the confinement period. When the Senate Intelligence Committee released its report on CIA-enhanced interrogation in 2014, investigators noted that several techniques used against Nosenko in the 1960s, sleep disruption, sensory manipulation, isolation, dietary control, appeared in the post-9/11 enhanced interrogation program as if they had been newly developed. They weren't new. They had been tested on Yuri Nosenko in a concrete room in Virginia 40 years earlier. Here is the part of this story that has never been fully resolved. The question Nosenko walked in carrying, the question about the KGB, about Oswald, about whether the Soviet Union had any connection to the Kennedy assassination. That question remains technically open. The Warren Commission accepted Nosenko's account. The KGB did not recruit Oswald. The Soviet Union was not involved in Kennedy's death. This became the official record. The House Select Committee on Assassinations in 1979 also concluded that the Soviet government was not involved. But notably, they reached this conclusion despite expressing significant reservations about the CIA's handling of Nosenko. In a 1992 interview, Nosenko said something that has stayed in the declassified record. He said, "If I had been believed from the beginning, the whole history of how America understood the assassination might have been different, but they couldn't believe me. It was simpler to destroy me." Here is the fact that gives that statement its full weight. As of 2023, portions of the CIA's file on Lee Harvey Oswald remain classified, not released, 60 years after the assassination. The National Archives has cited national security concerns in continuing to withhold approximately 3% of the total Kennedy assassination files. 3% after 60 years. The question is, what is in that 3% that cannot yet be released? Even Nosenko's own CIA file contains ongoing redactions that were maintained as recently as the 2010s. A man who died in 2008, whose case was supposedly resolved in 1969, still partially classified. When the photographs from Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq surfaced in 2004 and the United States was forced to confront what its interrogators had been doing, the official position was that these techniques had emerged from post-9/11 desperation. Improvised under pressure. Novel. The historical record tells a different story. The SERI program, Survival, Evasion, Resistance, Escape, which taught American soldiers to withstand enemy interrogation, had been deliberately studying and cataloging coercive techniques since the 1950s. Some of those techniques were reverse-engineered from what the CIA itself had been doing. Nosenko's imprisonment coincided almost exactly with the final active phase of MK-Ultra, the CIA's program of non-consensual human experimentation using drugs, hypnosis, and psychological manipulation. The same agency, the same era, the same fundamental premise that the human mind could be broken, controlled, and reconstructed through applied pressure. Declassified documents indicate that CIA Technical Services Division officers, the same division that administered MK-Ultra, were consulted during the Nosenko confinement period regarding the most effective methods of maintaining psychological pressure. When lawyers in the Office of Legal Counsel drafted the 2002 memos authorizing enhanced interrogation for terror suspects, they were not working from first principles. There was an institutional memory. There were files. There were lessons from a concrete room in Virginia from 40 years earlier. The thread runs straight, and it was never supposed to be visible. After his release in 1969, Yuri Nosenko lived out his life in the United States under a protected identity. He worked for the CIA for decades as a consultant. He briefed FBI counterintelligence officers. He helped train a generation of American intelligence professionals in the methods of KGB surveillance. In 1978, he gave classified testimony to a congressional committee about his treatment. In 2003, a portion of that testimony was declassified. In it, he described specific aspects of his confinement with a precision that left committee members visibly shaken, according to contemporaneous notes. He said in that testimony, "I want you to understand what it means to not hear another human voice for 4 months. I had forgotten what my own voice sounded like. I would speak to the walls just to remember." He maintained until his death that every claim he had made in 1964 was true. The KGB had not recruited Oswald. The KGB had not orchestrated Kennedy's assassination. He had told the truth from the first minute in the safe house in Geneva, in the snow, before anyone had put him in a box. Yuri Nosenko died in 2008. He was 80 years old. He had outlived Angleton by 21 years. He had outlived the Soviet Union by 17 years. He had outlived most of the men who had imprisoned him. His name is not on the CIA's memorial wall. He was never given a formal apology by the agency. The cash settlement, the consulting contract, the new identity. These were the CIA's way of closing the file without opening their mouth. In 2007, 1 year before his death, a letter from the CIA Director's Office acknowledged, in language so carefully hedged it barely qualifies as an apology, that his treatment had been inconsistent with the agency's standards. Inconsistent. 1,277 days. No windows, no voice, no charge, no trial. Here is what the thumbnail promised. Here is what the classified files actually reveal when you read them together in sequence, with the benefit of what has been declassified across 6 decades. The CIA did not imprison Nosenko because they were certain he was a spy. They imprisoned him because they were certain they couldn't afford to be wrong. The Kennedy assassination was 11 weeks old. The Warren Commission was taking testimony. If Nosenko was telling the truth, if the KGB really had nothing to do with it, that was one answer. But if Nosenko was lying, if the KGB had run Oswald and the CIA publicly accepted Nosenko's exoneration and it later came out, that was an institutional catastrophe with no recovery. Cannot be released under any circumstances until the risk calculation was this: a wrongly imprisoned defector was survivable. A missed Soviet assassination operation was not. But here is the second truth embedded in that phrase: he knew too much. Nosenko didn't just know about Oswald. By the time they let him out of that box, he knew everything the CIA had been willing to do to a man they couldn't publicly charge. He knew what the agency looked like from the inside of a concrete room. He knew that American intelligence, the defender of the free world, had held a man in conditions that would have been internationally condemned if they had happened in Moscow. In a 1992 interview, Nosenko said it directly: They were afraid of what I knew about them, not about Oswald, about themselves. The files confirm it. Every stage of disclosure, 1994, 2003, 2007, was delayed, hedged, and carefully limited, not because the information would help any foreign adversary, but because it would force a public reckoning with what the CIA had been willing to do in the dark to a man whose only crime was arriving at the wrong moment with the wrong message. James Angleton built a system for detecting deception so sensitive that it became indistinguishable from paranoia. He ran it inside an agency with no external oversight and no legal constraints on what it could do to a man who fell inside its walls. He was never prosecuted. He was never formally censured. He gave one major interview before his death in which he described his years at the CIA as a wilderness of mirrors, a phrase he borrowed from T.S. Eliot that became the defining metaphor for Cold War counterintelligence. In a wilderness of mirrors, you can't tell which reflection is real. Angleton lived there for 20 years. He made sure Nosenko lived there too, except Nosenko's mirror was a concrete wall and his wilderness was 12 feet by 12 feet. The precedent set in that room didn't stay in that room. The logic that national security justifies extrajudicial imprisonment, that a man can be held without charge if the intelligence implications are significant enough, that consistency under torture proves sophistication rather than innocence. That logic migrated. It found new legal frameworks, new justifications, new names. It found Guantanamo Bay. The Senate Intelligence Committee's 2014 report on CIA detention and interrogation ran to 6,700 pages in its classified form. 500 pages were released publicly. In those pages, reviewers found a consistent pattern. The agency had overstated the effectiveness of coercive techniques, had failed to keep accurate records, and had misled congressional oversight about what it was doing. Overstated effectiveness, failed to keep accurate records, misled oversight. Those three failures appeared in every review of the Nosenko case conducted between 1968 and 1994. 50 years earlier, same agency, same pattern. Yuri Nosenko spent his final years in a house somewhere in the American South, under a name that is still not publicly confirmed in full. He consulted for the CIA. He read books, something they had denied him for 18 months. He reportedly grew a garden, a man who had survived 1,277 days without a window, spending his final years growing things that needed light. Here is the final thing the files reveal, the thing that gives this story its full and terrible weight. The CIA, despite the 1969 review, despite the 1994 Inspector General report, despite the 2007 letter, never formally closed Nosenko's case with a finding of innocence. His official counterintelligence file, according to documents released under FOIA, remains categorized as unresolved, not innocent, not guilty, unresolved. The man they imprisoned for 5 years, the man they paid a settlement to, the man they hired as a consultant, the man who worked for them for decades, they never officially decided he was telling the truth. He knew too much to trust, too much to release, too much to charge, too much to believe, and ultimately, too much to ever fully clear. The light in his cell was never turned off, not once. In 3.5 years. That's how they wanted it. If you made it to the end of this one, the next video goes somewhere you won't expect. There is a network of underground government facilities built during the Cold War that was never decommissioned. Some of them are still listed as active in federal budget documents. And the people who were supposed to occupy them? They've never been publicly identified. That file is open, and it goes deep. Subscribe. The next document drops soon, and some of what's in it has never been on this platform before.